Some names become synonymous with darkness itself. Welcome to the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening a case that challenges everything we think we know about the human mind, about responsibility, about the very nature of evil. But before we descend into this abyss together, I need to ask something of you. This is a new endeavor, a channel dedicated to the stories that haunt the margins of history, and we're trying to reach 100 subscribers. If you find yourself drawn to these midnight investigations, please subscribe. Hit that like button. We're aiming for 50 likes on this video, a small gesture that tells me these stories matter to you as much as they do to me. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far into the darkness these files reach. What you're about to hear is a true story. Not folklore, not urban legend, but documented history. Though I confess, some of the most disturbing details have been omitted due to platform guidelines. The full horror of this case defies telling in any public forum. What remains is still enough to keep you awake long after this video ends. The story begins not with a crime, but with a question that has troubled criminologists, psychiatrists, and legal scholars for nearly a century. Can a human being be so broken, so fundamentally altered by forces beyond their control, that they cease to be responsible for their actions? Or is there a point where illness becomes indistinguishable from evil, where we must simply accept that some darkness cannot be explained away? In the winter of 1934, a family in Brooklyn received a letter. The envelope was ordinary enough, simple stationery, careful handwriting, a Manhattan postmark. But the contents would shatter whatever remained of their already fractured world. For 6 years they had waited, hoped, prayed for news of their daughter. 10-year-old Grace Budd had vanished on a June afternoon in 1928, and the investigation had long since grown cold. Police had chased hundreds of leads. They'd arrested suspects. They'd followed tips from psychics, from concerned citizens, from anonymous callers who claimed to know something, anything. All had led nowhere. Now finally, they had their answer, and it was worse than anything they could have imagined. The letter began with a rambling tale about sailors and hunger and things people do when civilization falls away. Then it pivoted, became specific, became personal. It detailed exactly what had happened to Grace in language deliberately crafted to inflict maximum psychological damage. The writer described her final moments with the cold precision of a butcher discussing cuts of meat. He signed it with a symbol, posted it from Manhattan, and waited. He wanted to be caught, or perhaps more accurately, he wanted the recognition. After all, what good is a masterpiece if no one knows you painted it? His name was Albert Hamilton Fish. He was 64 years old when he wrote that letter, a soft-spoken house painter with grey hair and gentle eyes. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, somewhat eccentric old man who lived modestly, who spoke politely, who seemed harmless in that invisible way elderly men often do. He had been a father, a husband, a working man who painted houses across New York City for decades. He looked like someone's grandfather. He was, in fact, something else entirely. The authorities would come to know him by other names. The Grey Man, because of his hair and his ability to blend into any street corner, any crowd, any neighborhood without drawing attention. The Brooklyn Vampire, for reasons we'll explore but which I'll handle carefully. The Werewolf of Wisteria, named for the location of one of his crimes, the Moon Maniac. The Boogey Man, perhaps the most apt of all because Fish had become the literal incarnation of the monster children feared in the dark. Each moniker attempting to capture something fundamentally monstrous, something that transcended ordinary criminality, because Albert Fish wasn't simply someone who had done terrible things. He was someone who had become something terrible, a transformation so complete that experts would spend years arguing about whether the man who wrote that letter was even capable of understanding what he'd done. If you're still with me, if you haven't closed this video in revulsion or disbelief, then perhaps you're like me, someone who believes we must understand the darkest chapters of human history, not to celebrate them, but to learn from them, to recognize the warning signs, to ask the uncomfortable questions about mental illness, about justice, about where society's responsibility begins and ends. Let me take you back to the beginning, to Washington, D.C. in 1870, when a boy was born who should have been ordinary. Albert Fish entered the world on May 19th, already marked by tragedy and genetic vulnerability. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old, an almost unthinkable age for fatherhood in that era. Think about that for a moment. In 1870, when life expectancy hovered around 40 years, when most men were grandfathers by 50, Randall Fish was welcoming a newborn son at an age when most of his contemporaries were already in their graves. His mother, Ellen Howell Fish, experienced hallucinations and periods of profound psychological distress. The family tree was riddled with mental illness. An uncle confined to an institution for mania, a sister similarly institutionalized, cousins and relatives across 2 generations exhibiting signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychiatric disorders. This wasn't a family touched by mental illness. It was saturated with it, generation after generation, passing down vulnerabilities that no one in that era understood or knew how to treat. Modern research tells us something frightening about genetic predisposition to psychosis. If you have no family history, your baseline risk is less than 1%. If one parent has experienced psychosis, that risk jumps to 8 to 10%, nearly tenfold. If multiple relatives across multiple generations show signs of severe mental illness, the risk compounds exponentially. Albert Fish wasn't just at risk. He was, from the moment of conception, walking a genetic tightrope over an abyss. When he was 5 years old, his father suffered a heart attack and passed away. Ellen Fish, a widow struggling with her own mental health issues and suddenly alone with a young son, made a decision that would prove catastrophic. She placed young Albert in St. John's Orphanage, an institution in Washington that operated under the harsh disciplinary standards of the late 19th century. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what orphanages were like in that era. These weren't the sanitized, regulated institutions we imagine today. They were often brutal places, operating under a philosophy that children, especially poor children, orphaned children, unwanted children, needed to have their will broken, their spirits subdued, their bodies disciplined into submission. The staff believed firmly in corporal punishment, in public humiliation as a teaching tool, in breaking difficult youngsters through systematic degradation. What happened in that orphanage transformed the boy. Albert was beaten regularly, sometimes in front of other residents, as an example of what happened to boys who misbehaved. He would later recall these experiences with disturbing clarity, not as trauma that haunted him, but as something else. Something that awakened in him a response he couldn't name at the time, a confusion of pain and something that felt almost like pleasure. The beatings hurt, certainly, but they also produced in him a sensation he'd never experienced before, a tingling warmth that spread through his body even as tears ran down his face. This is how sexual pathology can begin, not through some innate evil, but through the rewiring of developing neural pathways at the most vulnerable age. Pain and humiliation became associated in young Albert's brain with arousal and release. His psychosexual development, which should have been progressing normally, was fundamentally altered. The boy who eventually left that orphanage had learned to associate suffering with gratification, humiliation with desire. He was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. By the time his mother retrieved him years later, when her financial situation had improved enough to take him back, the damage was irreversible. But no one knew. No one suspected. He was just a quiet boy who seemed perhaps a bit withdrawn, a bit strange, but nothing that raised serious alarm. During his time in the orphanage, he also fell from a cherry tree, sustaining a head injury that left him with chronic, debilitating headaches for the rest of his life. He would describe these headaches decades later as blinding, as moments when his skull felt like it was splitting open. Some theorists have speculated that this trauma, combined with his genetic vulnerabilities, may have contributed to later behavioral abnormalities. The human brain is frighteningly fragile, especially a developing brain. We're only beginning to understand how early injuries, physical and psychological, can cascade into lifelong consequences. By age 12, Albert had been introduced by older boys to practices that most adults never encounter: sexual behaviors involving bodily functions, humiliation, dominance, and submission. These weren't just experiments of adolescent curiosity. They became foundational to his understanding of sexuality itself. By the time he was a teenager, his arousal patterns were firmly established and profoundly deviant. When he moved to New York City in his early 20s, he entered a shadow world that existed beneath the respectable surface of late 19th century America. He worked as a house painter by day, a trade he'd learned and would maintain throughout his life. House painting was perfect for him. It was solitary work. It took him into people's homes, but without requiring deep social connection, and it allowed him to move from neighborhood to neighborhood without attracting attention. But at night, he explored the darker corners of human desire. New York in the 1890s had a thriving underground of brothels, male prostitution, establishments where any appetite could be satisfied for the right price. Fish became a regular in this world, both as a client and as someone who sold his own body. This wasn't about financial need. He made adequate money painting. This was about feeding something in himself that demanded constant attention. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him, a common practice at the time for families concerned about their adult children's prospects. Marriage was seen as a stabilizing force, something that might correct whatever wayward tendencies a young man exhibited. Albert married and fathered 6 children over the following years. From the outside, he appeared to be a functioning member of society, employed, married, raising a family in working-class New York. But his wife would eventually leave him, reportedly unable to tolerate his increasingly disturbing behaviors and demands. What exactly drove her away remains unclear. She never spoke publicly about their marriage. But we can infer from Fish's later confessions and psychiatric evaluations that his sexual practices at home must have been deeply troubling. By the time his wife left, probably around 1917 or so, Fish was already deeply entrenched in patterns that would horrify any normal spouse. If you're finding this story as compelling as it is disturbing, I'd ask you to take a moment and share this video with someone you think would appreciate it. These stories need to be told, need to be remembered. The subscribe button is right there. Help us reach those first 100 souls willing to venture into the Midnight Files with me. What made Albert Fish particularly challenging for psychiatrists and law enforcement wasn't just the nature of his crimes, but the sheer breadth of his pathologies. When he was eventually evaluated by Dr. Frederick Wertham, one of the era's most respected forensic psychiatrists, Wertham testified that Fish exhibited every known sexual deviation documented in medical literature. Every single one. In Wertham's extensive career evaluating criminals and disturbed individuals, he had never encountered anyone remotely comparable. The list is extensive, disturbing, and clinically significant. Fish experienced arousal from inflicting pain on others, sadism. He also experienced arousal from receiving pain himself, masochism. These two typically exist separately, but in Fish they intertwined in a way that fed on itself, creating an escalating cycle. He engaged in exhibitionism, exposing himself to strangers on the street. He was a voyeur, finding gratification in observing others without their knowledge or consent. He practiced piquerism, the sexual arousal from piercing or stabbing, a particularly dangerous paraphilia because it often escalates. He admitted to acts of cannibalism, though whether this was primarily sexual or primarily delusional remains debated. He engaged in coprophagia and urophilia, practices involving bodily waste that I won't detail further. The point is that Fish's sexuality had expanded to encompass virtually every possible deviation from normal human desire. Most disturbing, perhaps, were his self-directed practices. After his arrest, when authorities x-rayed his body as part of the medical evaluation, they discovered something shocking. 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region. These weren't recent insertions. Some had been there for years, long enough that they'd become partially encased in scar tissue and could never be safely removed. Fish had been inserting needles into himself, slowly, methodically, over what must have been at least a decade. When asked why, he struggled to articulate an answer. It was pain, yes, but it was also purification. It was punishment, but also pleasure. It was atonement for sins he couldn't name and indulgence in desires he couldn't control. The needles represented the complete confusion in his mind between suffering and gratification, between punishment and reward. He regularly struck himself with a homemade paddle embedded with nails until he bled. He would do this in the bathroom, methodically, counting the strikes, watching the blood run down his legs. He inserted cotton balls soaked in lighter fluid into his rectum and ignited them, seeking some form of purification through agony. In a rare moment of almost poignant self-awareness, he once lamented, "If only pain were not so painful." Think about that statement. It reveals someone trapped in a compulsion they couldn't escape, seeking something through suffering that suffering could never actually provide. Even more disturbing, he even involved others in his practices, encouraging youngsters to strike him with that nail-studded paddle, a perversion of familial activity that speaks to how completely his pathology had infiltrated every aspect of his existence. He would present it as a game, something strange perhaps, but harmless, and they, not understanding what they were participating in, would sometimes comply. Dr. Frederick Wertham would later write that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon, stating that nowhere in legal or medical records existed another individual who possessed so many documented sexual abnormalities. Fish wasn't just ill, he was a singularity, an outlier so extreme that he challenged existing medical frameworks. Wertham had studied criminal psychology extensively, had evaluated hundreds of disturbed individuals, had written extensively about sexual pathology, and Fish stood alone in his experience. Around 1910, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden in Wilmington, Delaware. Kedden was intellectually disabled, vulnerable, and alone, exactly the kind of person Fish had learned to identify as unlikely to be protected by family or authorities. What transpired between them remains partially obscured by time and Fish's unreliable testimony, but the broad outlines are documented and horrifying. Fish transported Kedden to an abandoned farmhouse where he kept him for 2 weeks. During that time, Fish subjected him to escalating acts of sadistic violence that culminated in Fish severing half of Kedden's penis with a straight razor. Describing this event years later, Fish recalled with chilling clarity, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me. That detail, the scream, the look, these are the observations of someone who was paying close attention, someone present in the moment, someone who remembered it with a collector's care for detail. This wasn't a dissociative fugue state. This was someone fully conscious, fully aware, cataloging the experience for later recall." Fish claimed he had initially planned to end Kedden's life and transport his dismembered remains home, but feared the summer heat would cause decomposition that would attract attention during transport. So instead, he poured peroxide over the wound, practical first aid to prevent infection, wrapped it with a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left $10 on a table, kissed Kedden goodbye and departed. Kedden survived. He would be one of the few. This incident is significant because it reveals something crucial about Fish's psychology. Even in the midst of profound sadistic action, he retained enough rational calculation to assess risk, to consider detection, to make pragmatic decisions based on consequences. He thought about the summer heat. He thought about decomposition and smell. He thought about police investigation and transportation logistics. This wasn't the behavior of someone completely divorced from reality. This was someone who could toggle between pathological compulsion and calculated planning. It's also significant because it represents a turning point. Before Kedden, Fish's pathology had been primarily self-directed and involved consensual adult encounters in the underground sexual world of New York. After Kedden, something had been crossed. He had proven to himself that he could act on his darkest impulses and escape consequence. That knowledge would prove catastrophic. Around 1919, something changed in Albert Fish. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say something new emerged, a framework that would organize and justify his existing impulses. He began to experience what he interpreted as divine communications. God was speaking to him, he believed, issuing commands and revealing truths. His focus became obsessively centered on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, the patriarch commanded by God to sacrifice his beloved son as proof of faith. Fish read and reread this passage, finding in it a template for his own desires. God had commanded Abraham to take his son to a mountain and end the boy's life as a sacrifice. Abraham had complied without question, demonstrating perfect faith. Only at the last moment had God intervened, stopping Abraham's hand and providing a ram for sacrifice instead. The message, as traditional religious teaching interprets it, is about absolute obedience to divine will. But Fish read it differently. He believed he was receiving similar commands, that he was being directed to offer sacrifices, to enact rituals of suffering and consumption as acts of religious devotion. These weren't vague impressions or metaphorical interpretations. They were, to him, as real and direct as any conversation. He heard voices, whether internal or external he couldn't always distinguish, telling him what he must do. Whether these experiences represented genuine psychotic breaks with reality or elaborate rationalizations constructed by Fish to justify pre-existing desires remains one of the central debates of his case. Were these delusions, involuntary cognitive distortions characteristic of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, or were they what one might call convenient insanity? Beliefs adopted because they permitted actions he already wished to take. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Fish likely experienced genuine psychotic symptoms, auditory hallucinations, religious delusions, disordered thinking. But he also retained enough rational functioning to shape these delusions in ways that aligned with his existing desires. The delusions weren't controlling him like a puppet, they were providing him with permission and justification for things he already wanted to do. Regardless of their psychological origin, these religious convictions provided structure to Fish's subsequent actions. He began carrying what he called his implements, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, a small handsaw. These tools were prepared, maintained, transported with care. He wrapped them carefully, kept them sharp, carried them in a bag as he moved through the city. He was methodical, organized, deliberate. He also developed a victim selection pattern that reveals the calculating aspect of his mind even amid religious mania. He specifically targeted individuals he believed would not be missed, those on society's margins, people whose disappearances might not trigger extensive investigations. He looked for the vulnerable, those with developmental disabilities who might not be able to clearly report what happened to them, those from impoverished families who lacked resources to pressure police, those from minority communities who received less attention from authorities. This pragmatic cruelty speaks to someone who understood exactly how the world worked, who could predict police behavior and societal indifference with disturbing accuracy. Even as he heard God's voice commanding him to sacrifice, he was also calculating which sacrifices would be least likely to result in his capture. That duality, psychotic delusion combined with rational risk assessment, is what makes Fish's case so complex and so troubling for theories of criminal responsibility. Now we come to the confirmed cases, the ones where evidence and confession align, where we can say with certainty, this happened. I'll handle these carefully, avoiding the graphic details that violate platform guidelines while still conveying the essential facts. On July 15, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonnell vanished from Staten Island while playing near his home on a summer afternoon. His body was discovered days later in a wooded area, suspended from a tree. The cause of his passing was determined to be strangulation, and there was evidence of assault and extensive injuries to his body. For years, this case remained unsolved. Staten Island police had few leads. Francis had simply vanished from his neighborhood in broad daylight, with no witnesses reporting anything unusual. It wasn't until after Fish's arrest for another crime that he confessed to Francis's end. He claimed he had intended more but fled when he heard people approaching through the woods. That detail, the interrupted intention, suggests his actions weren't impulsive explosions of rage, but planned events that could be abandoned if circumstances threatened exposure. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney disappeared from the hallway of his Brooklyn apartment building where he'd been playing with a friend. The friend told police that the Boogey Man took him. That phrase would haunt the investigation, the convergence of childhood nightmare and terrible reality. Billy simply vanished, there one moment and gone the next. In his later confession, Fish described what he had done with clinical detachment as if discussing a carpentry project rather than an act of horror. According to a letter he wrote to Billy's mother, a letter authorities deemed too disturbing to release publicly, he had kept the boy for some time before ending his life. The letter contained details about his actions afterward that cannot be repeated here. Billy Gaffney's remains have never been recovered. His mother never received even the small mercy of a burial, of a place to visit, of any physical evidence that her son had existed beyond photographs. That absence is its own form of torture, the not knowing compounding the knowing. These two cases, Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney, would only be definitively connected to Fish after the crime that finally brought him into custody. The crime that would become his signature case, the one that would seal his infamy, the disappearance of Grace Budd. In May of 1928, Edward Budd placed a classified advertisement in the New York World newspaper. He was 18, strong, willing to work hard, looking for employment to help support his family during difficult economic times. The advertisement read something like, "Young man 18, wishes position in country, strong, willing worker. Contact Edward Budd." It was an ordinary ad, the kind placed by thousands of young men across the city every week. Someone responded. A man who identified himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island, who claimed he was looking to hire help for his property. He sent a friendly letter expressing interest in meeting Edward to discuss the position. On May 28th, this man visited the Budd family at their home at 406 West 15th Street in Manhattan. The Budd family lived in a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Money was tight. The prospect of steady work for Edward was more than welcome. It was needed. Frank Howard made an excellent impression. He arrived well-dressed in a suit, carrying himself with the dignity of a successful farmer. He was courteous, soft-spoken, generous. He brought gifts, pot cheese and fresh strawberries, treats the family wouldn't normally be able to afford. He spoke enthusiastically about his farm, about the work available, about how Edward would fit in perfectly. He seemed prosperous but not showy, respectable in that solid rural way that city families often romanticized. The Budds welcomed him warmly. Delia Flanagan Budd, the mother, was charmed by his manners. Albert Budd Sr., the father, was impressed by his business sense. Edward was excited about the opportunity, and 10-year-old Grace was delighted by the attention, by the strawberries, by this interesting visitor who seemed so kind. In his later confession, Fish wrote with chilling directness, "Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her." This wasn't impulsive. This was a decision made in a family's living room while consuming strawberries, while small talk filled the air, while parents planned their son's future employment. Fish, calling himself Frank Howard, left that day having planted seeds for what would come next. He told the Budds he would return in a few days to finalize arrangements for Edward's employment and to bring him to the farm. Days later, on June 3rd, Frank Howard returned as promised. But he came with a different proposition. He explained that his niece was having a birthday party that afternoon at her home in Harlem, and he wondered if Grace might like to attend. There would be other youngsters there, games, cake, all perfectly wholesome and innocent. It would give Grace a special treat while the adults finalized the employment details for Edward. Grace was excited. She dressed in her Sunday best, a white confirmation dress, her finest clothes. She was a beautiful child, dark-haired and bright-eyed, thrilled at the prospect of a party. Her parents, trusting this seemingly respectable farmer, who had been so generous and kind during his first visit, agreed without hesitation. They watched their daughter leave with Frank Howard, expecting her home that evening with stories of cake and games. She never returned. Frank Howard, of course, was Albert Fish. There was no niece, no birthday party, no farm in Farmingdale. There was only an abandoned house in Westchester County, Wisteria Cottage at 359 Mountain Road in Irvington, New York, that Fish had scouted in advance, specifically looking for an isolated location where he wouldn't be interrupted. What happened in that house I will tell you only in outline, and even then I'll omit the worst details. The full account exists in Fish's confession letter, in police reports, in psychiatric testimony. They are among the most disturbing documents in American criminal history, and we're not permitted, nor would I wish, to share them fully here. Fish took Grace to the empty house. He told her to wait outside while he prepared something inside. She picked wildflowers in the overgrown yard, unaware, still believing she was going to a party. When he called her inside, everything changed. Fish later admitted to his attorney, in confidence not in public statements, that he experienced involuntary physical responses during Grace's final moments. This detail is significant because Fish, in his public confessions, consistently denied any assault, as if maintaining some twisted code of ethics, even in the midst of admitting to other atrocities. He wanted people to believe he had killed her quickly, painlessly, without violation. The truth, revealed privately to his lawyer, was more complex and more terrible. He claimed it took him 9 days to fully consume her remains. Whether this is factual or another of Fish's many exaggerations remains unknown. Serial offenders frequently inflate their crimes, seeking to maximize shock and notoriety. But what is certain is that Grace Budd ceased to exist that June afternoon, erased from the world by a man who had convinced her parents he was trustworthy. For 6 years, the Budd family lived in agonizing uncertainty. Grace was listed as missing. Her photograph appeared in newspapers, on flyers, in police stations across the region. The investigation consumed resources and attention. Detective William King, who would eventually solve the case, devoted himself to finding Grace, or at least discovering what had happened to her. Police chased hundreds of leads. They investigated reports of Grace being seen in different cities. They received tips from people claiming to have information. They followed up on every possible connection, every potential suspect. The case grew cold, not from lack of effort, but from lack of evidence. Grace had simply vanished, and Frank Howard had vanished with her. Police even arrested an innocent man, Charles Edward Pope, a building superintendent suspected by his estranged wife of involvement in Grace's disappearance. Pope spent over 100 days in jail before being cleared of any connection to the case. His life was destroyed by the false accusation, even after his exoneration. And then, in November of 1934, 6 years after Grace's disappearance, that letter arrived at the Budd home. Before we continue into the investigation and trial, I want to ask something of you watching now. If this story has affected you, if you feel the weight of it as I do, leave a comment. Not just telling me where you're watching from, though I'd love to know that too, but sharing your thoughts. These aren't easy stories to hear, and they shouldn't be. The discomfort you feel is appropriate. It's human, and it's important. Detective William King of the New York Police Department was the investigator who had never stopped working Grace's case. While other detectives had moved on to fresher investigations, King remained convinced that Grace Budd's disappearance could be solved. When that confession letter arrived at the Budd home in November 1934, the family immediately contacted King. King recognized the letter for what it was, a gift from the perpetrator himself, an arrogance or compulsion that provided exactly what was needed to close the case. But the letter itself didn't identify the writer. It was anonymous, signed only with a strange symbol. The challenge was tracing it back to its source. The stationery was distinctive, a particular kind of paper not commonly available. King began the painstaking work of tracing where this stationery might have come from. The envelope bore a postmark from a specific area of Manhattan. Through methodical detective work, the kind that involved visiting every stationery shop, every boarding house, every hotel in the area, showing the stationery sample and asking if anyone recognized it, King slowly narrowed the possibilities. The trail led to a boarding house on East 52nd Street. The landlady remembered the distinctive stationery because it had been left behind in a room by a tenant who'd recently moved out. The tenant was an elderly man, quiet, polite, a house painter who'd stayed for several weeks before departing. She remembered his name, Albert Fish. King located Fish's new address through employment records. Fish had recently taken a painting job and had left a forwarding address. On December 13, 1934, Detective King went to the address and waited. When Fish arrived that evening, King approached and identified himself. For a moment, Fish's hand moved toward his pocket, where he habitually kept a straight razor. But King was faster, grabbing Fish's arm and disarming him before violence could erupt. Fish didn't resist further. He seemed almost relieved, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. At police headquarters, Fish didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed almost eager to talk. He confessed to Grace's fate in detail, answering questions with the calm precision of someone discussing carpentry work or house painting. His voice never wavered. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition that what he was describing was monstrous. He might have been describing what he'd eaten for breakfast. When asked why he had written that letter, why he had detailed such horrors to a grieving mother 6 years after the fact, Fish's response was telling. He wanted to relive it, to extend the crime beyond its physical conclusion into an ongoing psychological torture. The suffering he could inflict through words was, for him, a continuation of the act itself. The confession was part of the crime. This psychological component, the need not just to commit the act but to revisit it, to force the victim's family to visualize every detail, reveals something important about Fish's pathology. He wasn't killing in moments of uncontrollable rage or compulsion. He was extracting maximum psychological impact from each crime, planning not just the act but its aftermath, its revelation, its ability to generate lasting horror. Fish confessed to 3 cases in total: Grace Budd, Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney. These are the only ones police could definitively connect to known disappearances, and for which physical or circumstantial evidence existed to corroborate Fish's statements. But Fish also made broader, vaguer claims. He boasted that he had harmed individuals in every state. He suggested victim numbers approaching 100, though it was never clear whether he meant assault or something worse, or was simply exaggerating to enhance his infamy. Serial offenders frequently do this: inflate their numbers, claim responsibility for crimes they didn't commit, craft a larger-than-life persona. Police suspected him in several other cases. Yetta Abramowitz, 12 years old, found deceased on a Bronx rooftop in 1927, with witnesses reporting a man matching Fish's description in the area. Mary Ellen O'Connor, 16, discovered in Far Rockaway, Queens, near a house where Fish had been working. Emma Richardson, 5 years old, who vanished in 1926. Benjamin Collings, 17, who disappeared in 1932. Others whose names appear in police files with question marks beside them. A 2020 criminological study attempted to analyze Fish's claims systematically, distinguishing between confirmed cases, probable cases, and possible cases. They suggested the true number of victims might be as high as 42, with 31 described as well-documented, based on confessions and police records. But we'll never know for certain. Fish was an unreliable narrator of his own story, prone to exaggeration, seeking notoriety, crafting a legacy of horror. And in the 1920s and 1930s, investigative capabilities were limited. No centralized databases, no DNA evidence, no criminal profiling techniques. Cases across different jurisdictions couldn't be easily connected. Moreover, Fish specifically targeted those on society's margins. These disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated, a reflection of the era's systemic indifference to vulnerable populations. How many people vanished without police reports being filed? How many families, lacking resources or facing discrimination, simply grieved privately without expecting justice? Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. It would last 10 days and would become a landmark case in forensic psychiatry and criminal law. Judge Frederick P. Close presided. Westchester County Chief Assistant District Attorney Elbert Gallagher led the prosecution, and defense attorney James Dempsey, a former prosecutor himself and one-time mayor of Peekskill, mounted the defense. The central legal question was deceptively simple. Was Albert Fish legally insane under the Manhattan Rule, the prevailing standard that required proving he could not understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions due to mental illness? For the defense, Dempsey brought in Dr. Frederick Wortham, a senior psychiatrist at Bellevue Hospital, and one of the era's most respected minds in criminal psychology. Wortham had spent extensive time evaluating Fish, interviewing him for hours, reviewing his history, conducting physical examinations, analyzing his writings and statements. His testimony was comprehensive and deeply disturbing. Wortham began by detailing Fish's family history of mental illness spanning multiple generations. He described the childhood trauma at St. John's Orphanage, the systematic abuse that had rewired Fish's psychosexual development. He presented the X-rays showing 29 embedded needles as physical evidence of profound psychological disturbance, arguing that no sane person would repeatedly insert needles into their own body over many years. He explained Fish's religious delusions in detail. Fish genuinely believed he was receiving commands from God. He believed angels communicated with him, providing guidance and occasionally interceding to prevent him from committing acts. This wasn't metaphorical religious feeling. Fish experienced auditory hallucinations, visual phenomena, a complete delusional system built around sacrifice and atonement. Wortham testified that Fish had undergone a significant deterioration approximately 10 years prior to his arrest, marked by what he termed an outspoken medical disease, a combination of religious mania and what appeared to be organic brain deterioration, possibly arterial sclerosis affecting cognitive function. The Fish of 1934 was not the same as the Fish of 1924 or even 1920. Something had broken further, accelerating his decline from merely deviant to genuinely psychotic. Most crucially, Wortham introduced the concept of insane knowledge. When the prosecutor asked whether Fish knew the difference between right and wrong, the core question under the Amnachton rule, Wortham provided a nuanced answer that would influence psychiatric testimony for decades to come. Yes, Wortham explained, Fish knew the difference between right and wrong, but he knew it through a profoundly distorted lens based on delusional religious beliefs. He knew society considered his actions wrong. He knew they violated legal and moral codes. But he also genuinely believed, or had convinced himself he believed, that divine commands superseded human law. This created a state where technical legal knowledge existed alongside psychotic reasoning. This was, Wortham argued, insane knowledge, a distinction the Amnachton rule couldn't adequately address. Fish wasn't someone who couldn't tell right from wrong. He was someone whose understanding of right and wrong had been fundamentally warped by severe mental illness. The legal standard, designed in 1843 for simpler cases of obvious delusion, struggled to accommodate the complexity of Fish's condition. Wortham concluded his testimony by stating that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon for whom nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities. He urged the jury to recognize that Fish, despite his calculated behaviors, was profoundly mentally ill and not criminally responsible under any reasonable interpretation of insanity. The prosecution, led by Gallagher, took a fundamentally different approach. They didn't dispute that Fish was disturbed, even deeply disturbed. But disturbed, they argued, was not the same as insane. Evil was not the same as madness. And the law required a very specific threshold for criminal insanity, that the defendant could not understand the wrongfulness of his actions. Gallagher emphasized Fish's premeditation and planning. He had carefully selected victims based on calculated predictions about police behavior. He had scouted locations in advance. He had prepared his tools systematically. He had concealed evidence. He had continued his activities across years without confession until he himself chose to reveal them. These were not the behaviors of someone divorced from reality. These were the behaviors of a calculating predator. The prosecution called their own expert witnesses. Dr. Perry Lichtenstein, a prison physician, testified that Fish's self-harm wasn't true masochism, but merely punishment to get gratification, implying conscious choice rather than compulsive pathology. This was a distinction without much difference in psychiatric terms, but it framed Fish's behavior as voluntary rather than driven by illness. Another prosecution witness, Dr. Charles Lambert, made an argument that seems bizarre in retrospect, but apparently carried weight with the jury. He testified that religious cannibalism was a matter of taste and not necessarily evidence of psychosis. Various cultures throughout history have practiced ritualized cannibalism, he noted. So Fish's claims about consuming human flesh in a religious context didn't automatically indicate insanity. This argument fundamentally missed the point. The issue wasn't whether cannibalism could ever be culturally normal. but whether Fish's specific beliefs and behaviors indicated a break with reality. But in the courtroom, with a jury desperate to find Fish sane so they could execute him, such arguments found purchase. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree offense in the case of Grace Budd, and sane. Albert Fish was sentenced to execution by electric chair. But here's where the story takes a troubling turn that raises profound questions about the justice system. Years later, when journalists and researchers interviewed the jurors about their decision, several admitted something disturbing. They believed Fish was insane. They thought he was profoundly mentally ill, exactly as Dr. Wertham had testified. But they voted to find him sane anyway, because they believed he deserved consequences regardless of his mental state. Think about what this means. The jury rejected the entire legal framework for assessing criminal responsibility because their moral intuition told them this man should not escape consequences. They believed the law's protection for the insane should not apply to someone whose crimes were this terrible, regardless of his mental state. Were they wrong? It's a question that divides legal scholars and ethicists to this day. On one hand, the insanity defense exists precisely to protect people who are so mentally ill they cannot be held criminally responsible. If juries can simply ignore that standard when crimes are sufficiently horrifying, then the protection becomes meaningless. On the other hand, one can understand the jury's perspective. They looked at Fish's calculated planning, his victim selection, his ability to function in society for decades. They saw someone who, despite his delusions, retained enough rational capacity to avoid detection. Should such a person be absolved of responsibility simply because he also happened to be psychotic? The case highlights a fundamental tension in criminal justice, the conflict between retribution and protection, between punishment and treatment, between holding people accountable and recognizing that mental illness can compromise moral agency. If you've made it this far in this story, I want to thank you for staying with me through some very dark territory. These cases aren't easy to discuss, but I believe they're important. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mental illness, and human nature. If you're finding value in this kind of deep investigation, please hit that subscribe button. We're building something here, a community willing to examine history's darkest chapters with honesty and thoughtfulness. Between his conviction and scheduled execution, Fish made additional confessions. He confirmed his involvement in the cases of Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney, finally giving those families some form of closure, however dark and incomplete. The McDonnell family learned what had happened to their son nearly 11 years after his disappearance. The Gaffney family learned the truth 8 years after Billy vanished. Both families had lived in that terrible liminal space of not knowing, of hoping against hope that somehow their boy might still be alive somewhere. Fish's confessions ended that hope, but provided a grim certainty. Fish also made grander, more sensational claims. He boasted that he had harmed individuals in every state in America. He suggested victim numbers approaching 100, though his statements were vague and contradictory. Sometimes he seemed to be talking about assault, other times about more serious crimes. The numbers shifted depending on who he was talking to and what kind of reaction he was seeking. This uncertainty about his true victim count is one of the enduring mysteries of the case. We know definitively about 3 cases. We strongly suspect several others. But beyond that lies a vast grey area of possible victims, unconfirmed claims, and cases that can never be definitively linked. Police files from the era contain notes about Fish in connection with several unsolved cases. Yetta Abramovitz, 12 years old, strangled and beaten on a Bronx rooftop on May 14, 1927. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Fish's description trying to lure girls into dark hallways that day, but there was no physical evidence connecting him, and Fish never explicitly confessed to her case. Mary Ellen O'Connor, 16 years old, found deceased in the woods near Far Rockaway, Queens, on February 15, 1932. Fish had been working as a house painter in that neighborhood at the time. The circumstances of her death bore some similarities to Fish's known methods, but again, no definitive proof. Emma Richardson, 5 years old, who disappeared on October 3, 1926. Sources differ on whether Fish ever confessed to involvement in her case. Some records suggest he did. Others indicate police merely suspected him based on proximity and timing. Benjamin Collins, 17, who vanished on December 15, 1932. Fish was questioned about this case but provided no clear confession. The list goes on. Each name represents a tragedy, a family destroyed, a life cut short. But we'll never know which of these cases, if any, were actually Fish's victims. A comprehensive 2020 criminological study attempted to analyze all of Fish's claims, cross-referencing them with police records, newspaper reports, and missing persons files from the era. The researchers distinguished between confirmed victims, probable victims, possible victims, and unlikely claims. Their conclusions suggested the true number might be as high as 42, with 31 described as well documented based on available evidence. But even this careful analysis had to acknowledge significant uncertainty. Fish was a compulsive liar and exaggerator. He enjoyed the attention his claims generated. He had every incentive to inflate his numbers to achieve maximum notoriety. How much of what he said was true? How much was fantasy or confabulation? We'll never know with certainty. And then there's the social context that enabled Fish to operate for so long. He specifically targeted the vulnerable, people with developmental disabilities, the homeless, impoverished families, racial minorities. These were populations that law enforcement in the 1920s and 1930s often ignored or gave minimal attention. Disappearances from these communities frequently went unreported or uninvestigated. How many people vanished during Fish's active years without police reports being filed? How many families lacking resources or facing discrimination simply grieved privately without expecting justice? The systemic indifference of that era means we'll never have a complete accounting of Fish's victims. On January 16, 1936, Albert Hamilton Fish was executed by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. He was 65 years old, gray-haired and frail-looking, walking to his execution with the shuffling gait of an elderly man. Witnesses reported that he entered the death chamber calmly at 11:06 p.m. He showed no fear, no remorse, no recognition of the gravity of the moment. The executioner positioned him in the chair, attached the electrodes to his leg and head. Fish helped adjust the cap that would deliver the electrical current, cooperative to the end. His final words were reported as both cryptic and deeply unsettling. "I don't even know why I'm here." That statement, delivered moments before his execution, encapsulates the central mystery of his entire case. Was this the genuine confusion of a psychotic individual who truly didn't understand why society was punishing him? A man so divorced from moral reality that he couldn't comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions? Or was it a final performance, a last twist of the knife, one more moment of manipulation and mystification from a man who'd spent his entire life deceiving others? I lean toward believing it was genuine, not because Fish was innocent or misunderstood, but because I think he genuinely existed in a different moral universe. His delusions had become so complete, his rationalizations so elaborate, that he may have truly believed he'd been doing God's work. The punishment, from his perspective, was unjust. He was being executed for following divine commands that others simply couldn't understand. A legend grew around Fish's execution that persists to this day. The story claims that the needles embedded in his body short-circuited the electric chair, requiring a second jolt to complete the execution. Some versions say sparks flew, that the chair malfunctioned dramatically, that Fish's body created an electrical anomaly. This is almost certainly folklore. Harold Schechter, who wrote the definitive biography of Fish and interviewed people connected to the case, disputes this account. He notes that execution records show nothing unusual, that Fish died quickly and efficiently like other condemned individuals. The story became part of Fish's mythology. One more supernatural element added to a figure already shrouded in horror. He was pronounced deceased at 11:09 p.m., just 3 minutes after entering the chamber. His body was removed and buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery, in an unmarked grave among other executed prisoners. No family claimed his remains. No memorial exists. He simply ceased to exist, buried and forgotten except in the files of criminologists and the nightmares of those who know his story. His attorney, James Dempsey, revealed something intriguing after the execution. He told journalists that Fish had written a final statement in the hours before his death, a document that Dempsey described as the most disturbing thing he'd ever read. When pressed by assembled journalists to reveal its contents or make it public, Dempsey refused categorically. He stated, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read. That document has never been made public. It presumably still exists somewhere in legal archives, sealed away, a final piece of Fish's psyche that he left behind. What did it contain? Confessions to additional crimes, sexual fantasies, religious ravings, a coherent explanation of his actions from his own warped perspective. We'll never know, and perhaps that's appropriate. Some darkness doesn't need to be brought into the light. So what do we make of Albert Fish? Nearly a century later, what lessons can we extract from this darkness? The psychiatric debate continues in academic circles. Modern forensic psychologists who've studied Fish's case from historical records tend to conclude that by contemporary diagnostic standards, he almost certainly suffered from multiple severe mental illnesses. The most likely diagnosis would be paranoid schizophrenia, given his religious delusions, possible auditory hallucinations, and increasingly disordered thinking in his later years. He also clearly suffered from multiple severe paraphilic disorders. His sexual interests were profoundly abnormal and caused harm to others. Modern psychiatry would classify his various paraphilias as disorders requiring intensive treatment, though whether they were treatable by any means available in his era is doubtful. There's also evidence suggesting possible organic brain disease. His childhood head injury, combined with what psychiatrists at the time identified as possible arterial sclerosis, suggests physical brain pathology that could have contributed to his deterioration. Modern brain imaging might have revealed lesions, abnormal structures, or damage that explained some of his symptoms. But he was also capable of extraordinary planning and calculation. He selected victims based on rational risk assessment. He prepared locations in advance. He concealed evidence. He functioned in society for decades, maintaining employment, navigating complex social situations, avoiding detection. These capabilities suggest preserved executive function and reality testing in certain domains. Perhaps the question itself, insane or evil, is inadequate. Perhaps Fish represents something more complex. A human being so damaged by the intersection of genetic vulnerability, catastrophic childhood trauma, and progressive brain disease that the normal architecture of moral reasoning collapsed entirely, leaving something that could toggle between psychotic delusion and calculating predation depending on the context. This is uncomfortable because it resists simple categorization. We want our monsters to be either mad or bad, not both. We want clear lines between criminal responsibility and mental illness. Fish's case demonstrates that those lines are far blurrier than our legal systems can easily accommodate. The jury's decision to convict despite believing he was insane raises its own troubling questions. If we acknowledge someone is mentally ill, profoundly ill, but execute them anyway because their crimes are sufficiently terrible, what does that say about our commitment to the insanity defense? If the protection only applies when crimes aren't too horrifying, then it's not really a protection based on mental state, but rather a judgment about which mentally ill people we're willing to excuse. On the other hand, one can understand the jury's moral intuition. They looked at Fish's life and saw decades of escalating predation. They saw calculation, planning, victim selection designed to avoid detection. They saw someone who, despite his delusions, clearly understood on some level that his actions would be punished if discovered. Should such a person be absolved simply because he also happened to be psychotic? There's no easy answer, and perhaps that's the point. The deepest moral questions don't have clean resolutions. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you believe these difficult conversations are worth having, I'd ask you once more to subscribe, to like this video, to share it with others who might find value in examining history's darkest chapters. We're trying to build something here, a space for thoughtful investigation of cases that challenge our assumptions and force us to confront uncomfortable truths. What we know with certainty is that Albert Fish represents a catastrophic failure at multiple levels, A failure of the mental health system. His family's history of severe mental illness should have been recognized as placing him at extreme risk, but no intervention occurred. A failure of child protection. The abuse he suffered at St. John's Orphanage was not unique to him but common practice, damaging countless children. A failure of early intervention. By the time Fish came to police attention, he'd been escalating for decades, with no one noticing the warning signs. And perhaps most significantly, a failure of societal protection for vulnerable populations. Fish operated for so long because he targeted people society didn't prioritize: the poor, the disabled, racial minorities, the marginalized. He correctly calculated that their disappearances wouldn't trigger the same investigative response as victims from more privileged backgrounds. That systemic indifference enabled his crimes. If every disappearance had been investigated with equal vigor, if every vulnerable person had been afforded equal protection, if every family had equal access to resources and attention, Fish's career would have been much shorter. This is where the historical case becomes relevant to the present. We've made progress: criminal databases, DNA evidence, better understanding of serial predation, more systematic investigation of missing persons. But systemic inequalities in how cases are investigated persist. Some victims still receive more attention than others. Some families still have more resources to demand justice than others. The question Fish's case forces us to confront is this: how do we identify and intervene with potentially dangerous individuals before they escalate to violence? How do we balance civil liberties with public safety? How do we treat mental illness that manifests in dangerous behaviors? How do we ensure equal protection for all potential victims, regardless of their social status? These aren't questions with simple answers, but they're questions we must continue asking. Grace Budd left her home in her finest dress, excited about a party that didn't exist. She was 10 years old, full of life and possibility, trusting in the goodness of adults, because that's what children do. She picked wildflowers while Fish prepared her fate. That image, a child picking flowers, unaware that her life is about to end, is almost unbearably sad. Francis MacDonald played near his home on a summer afternoon, enjoying the freedom children had in that era to roam their neighborhoods. Billy Gaffney stood in a hallway with a friend, two boys on the threshold of a game, not knowing the Boogey Man was real. All were ordinary moments that became doorways to nightmare because one profoundly damaged man found them in his path. We tell these stories not to celebrate darkness but to bear witness to it, to remember those who were lost, to honor their lives by refusing to let them be forgotten, to ask the difficult questions their deaths demand we confront, to recognize that the most profound horrors are often built not in single moments of rage, but across decades of deterioration, one damaged thought at a time, one ignored warning sign after another, one vulnerable victim society failed to protect. Albert Fish died in 1936, but the questions his case raises remain alive. About mental illness and criminal responsibility, about societal obligations to protect the vulnerable, about how we identify and intervene with dangerous individuals before tragedy occurs, about where the line between madness and evil lies, if such a line even exists. If stories like this stay with you, if they make you think and question and refuse to look away from difficult truths, then subscribe to the Midnight File, because there are more cases in these archives, more files that need opening, more questions that deserve asking. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts. I read everyone, and I value your perspectives on these complex cases. Thank you for walking this dark path with me tonight. Thank you for bearing witness to a story that needs to be told, however uncomfortable it makes us. Until the next case, this is Julian Cross, closing the file on the Brooklyn vampire, but knowing that the questions it raises will remain open long after the folder is put away. Every town keeps a secret. New York kept Albert Fish for decades, hidden in plain sight, walking among ordinary people while carrying unimaginable darkness within him. The files remain yellowing in archives, a record of what humans are capable of when the bonds of sanity and morality dissolve completely. Some darkness, once glimpsed, never entirely leaves you. This is one of those darknesses, and perhaps that's as it should be. We should be haunted by these stories. We should be troubled by the questions they raise, because only by confronting the worst of what humans can become do we have any hope of preventing such tragedies in the future. Good night. And remember, the next file may be darker still.